This is Chapter 16 on Gender, Racial Violence, and Spatialized Justice, the Murder of Pamela George. So Pamela was an Aboriginal woman who worked as a prostitute in Regina, Saskatchewan. She was brutally murdered on April 17, 1995. The two 19-year-olds that were convicted of the manslaughter only received 6.5 years, as well as the 20 months spent before trial. There's Pamela and the two people who were convicted. Members of the Native community and some of the white community objected against the case and believe it was at least second-degree murder. Does anyone else agree with that? Just a show of hands. Okay. So the judge was also accused of acting improperly and directing the jury. Okay. So, Stephen Comerfield and Alex Ternowetsky were the convicted, and Alex was released on parole after serving only 2/3 of his sentence. He faced more charges the following year, including assault, robbery, mischief, as well as impaired driving. So why was he let out after such a severe crime? This would be question time. Okay. So what actually happened was, after picking her up, they took her to an isolated area where they received oral sex, then brutally beat her and left her to die. The men confided their act of violence with one set of parents and a number of friends before they left town to start their summer jobs. In early May, the RCMP arrested both men. The trial can be written about as spatialized justice and the murder as gendered racial violence because of the lack of evidence available. The judge said Pamela's profession, which was a prostitute, did not degrade her at all, and it could not be considered to have led the jury to its conclusion. Do you guys agree with that? Or do you think the judge is just talking nonsense? So, in 1998, the Saskatchewan Court of Appeal rejected the appeal by the Crown that the trial judge had failed to fairly present the Crown's position that the two men had murdered Pamela George. The appeal court concluded that Mr. Justice Malone never made it clear to the jury that a finding of murder would require evidence that the accused intended to commit murder or knew their actions would result in Pamela George's death. There is some indication that the jury did indeed carefully consider whether there was enough evidence to convict on a charge of murder rather than manslaughter. I think it's wrong. So, Pamela George was considered to belong to a space of prostitution and aboriginality. The author's argument is one of race, space, and law. Because of these traits, she was treated as an outcast. The author also states that many people who are placed in undeserving situations has more to do with class than it does with race. So, although the author agrees that a white woman in the same situation may be treated the same way, she believes that race is what ultimately brought Pamela and her murders to this brutal encounter. She was seen as an Aboriginal woman working as a prostitute in a rough part of town, whilst the convicted were two middle-class white men who were university athletes. So, got the Aboriginal woman, the two high-class guys, just kind of fits the typical story. So the record showed that the two white boys lost control and an Aboriginal woman for a little more than she bargained for. The fact that an Aboriginal woman was brutally murdered seemed to be forgotten often. They only really cared that the two white boys lost control and it happened to an Aboriginal woman. They just kind of disregarded the fact that she was murdered. So, Aboriginal people make up approximately 8% of Regina's almost 200,000 population. Regina is seen as primarily a white city. So, sexual violence towards Aboriginal women was an integral part of the 19th century settler strategies of domination. In 1994, Saskatchewan had the highest level of incarceration of Aboriginals in Canada, which was 72%. 72. In 1997, First Nations women made up only 12%, 1 to 2% of the Canadian population, but represented 19% of federally sentenced women. By 1999, in the Saskatchewan Penitentiary, 80% of the men were Aboriginal. So the making of the white men, the two accused. So Alex T. and Stephen K. would have almost no chance of encountering an Aboriginal woman if they're in their everyday lives. Why did they leave their space of privilege to sought out poor and Aboriginal peoples just for sexual services? They have that whole, like, how many Aboriginal people are really there? They're never gonna run into an Aboriginal woman. Yet somehow they go to her for some sexual stuff. So white men can make it continue. Stephen Comerfield told his best friend Taylor Stewart that he beat the shit out of an Indian hooker, as well as, if you don't give us head, we're going to kill you. His friend was more concerned with Stephen passing on a disease to his girlfriend, and never had an indication of acknowledgement that a woman was brutally murdered. How would you act if you were his friend? It's ridiculous. So, after finally convincing Pamela George to perform oral sex, they announced that they should leave. As they were leaving, Comerfield dragged her out of the car and hit her. Neither could remember actually beating her. You really can't remember if you beat her. If they were that drunk not to remember brutally beating someone, do you now have a different outlook on on alcohol, or do you just not believe them? So do you think that this is bias or not? To be or not to be? During the trial, Pamela George was seen as a rightful target of the gendered violence inflicted by both of the males, and because she was consented to provide sexual services, the violence became more permissible. Right. Becomes more permissible now. Race, social position, and gender were made to disappear during the trial, and the sentencing, even though it was said all were taken into consideration before. So, even though they said it was all taken into consideration, it wasn't. So the prostitute and people off the street came to signify the racial other and spaces of violence. In contrast, the chalet, cottage, suburban home, and the isolated spaces in which the white men socialized were unmarked, naturally. So, I have some questions for you guys, just so you can answer. So, what do you think? I want to hear your comments, what you have to say. So, given the circumstances, do you feel the two males were sentenced correctly? And if so, why? Do you believe the judge and jury were biased towards Pamela George being a prostitute and Aboriginal? And if so, why? This concludes my presentation. Thank you.